Who can prove me a liar? Who can really sit back and say that I'm wrong and make my speech worthless? What I just said, make it worthless. Who can do that? And I don't really think anybody could or anybody can, because Job simply speaks the truth on the matters concerning righteous people and unrighteous people. So chapter 25 is 6 verses. Not very long. Bildad speaks. He doesn't speak much. And then after Bildad's speech, Job goes on this giant soliloquy. He just keeps going on and on and on. So chapter 25, then Bildad the Shuhite responded, "Dominion and awe belong to him who makes peace in his heights. Is there any number to his troops? And upon whom does his light not rise? How then can mankind be righteous with God? Or how can anyone who is born of woman be pure? If even the moon is no brightness and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and a son of man, that worm?" Okay, so now here's Bildad's argument. Here's the funny thing. Bildad is actually kind of right at this moment. Not in everything that he says, necessarily, but he is right to say that nobody can really be completely right before God, not based upon their own merits, because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Everyone has sinned. This is a common conception, even back at these times. Of course, the New Testament has revealed so much to us. But even back in the old days, people knew that people had sinned. There's a concept of sin. This is why pagan nations all around the world had priests. Because they all understood that people sinned and that people needed some sort of communication with a deity in order to be absolved of sins. Okay, how do you think things like child sacrifice got into the picture? Okay, the ancients understood that there's no forgiveness of sins without blood, and so they took it up a notch. I'm not going to sacrifice my bull I'm going to sacrifice my child, and this will absolve me. This will appease this deity's wrath upon me or upon our land. I think it was the ancient Aztecs who believed that a solar eclipse was a sign of a god bringing down wrath upon them and anger upon them. And so they would often have human sacrifices and things like that. The Vikings had human sacrifice. And I'm going into more recent history, but you go back even further and further, beginning even before Job, and we see there's a concept of sin. People understand this. And so because there's a concept of sin, Bildad goes on to talk about this and say, basically, everybody knows that we're not right before God. He says in verse 4, "How then can mankind be righteous with God, or how can anyone who is born of woman be pure?" Again, anyone born of woman is just another way of saying a human. So how can any human be pure? And this is the part that I don't agree with. It says, if even his moon has no brightness, or the moon has no brightness, verse 5, and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and a son of man, that worm. So this is very similar to language early in the book when Eliphaz mentions that a spirit came to him in the middle of the night, told him certain things. This is similar language to that. Basically, the moon isn't even bright to God. The stars are dim. And so if the moon doesn't even have enough glory for God, what makes you think that you can? Or me? Now, this is a weird thing for Bildad to kind of bring up because he's kind of proving Job's point almost. But nevertheless, this is what Bildad has to say. So, chapter 26, Job rebukes Bildad here, and it says, Job responds, "What a help you are to the weak. You have saved the arm without strength. What advice you have given to one without wisdom. What helpful insight you have abundantly provided. To whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit was expressed through you?" So, Job starts being sarcastic again. And he's, sarcastically saying, "Oh, thank you so much for being such a good friend and helping me out so much here. I really appreciate it. What advice you have given to one without wisdom." Again, this is just sarcasm. "What helpful insight you have abundantly provided." So, in other words, Job is saying, you're not true in what you're saying, and I don't believe a word of it, but I'm going to go ahead and sarcastically rebuke you in this moment. Then he goes on to speak about, of course, the greatness of God. He says in verse 5, "The departed spirits are made to tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Sheol is naked before him, and Abaddon has no covering. He stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them. He obscures the face of the full moon and spreads his cloud over it. He has inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters as the boundary, or at the boundary of light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. With his power he quieted the sea, and by his understanding he shattered Raha. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are the fringes of his ways, and how faint a word we hear of him. But his mighty thunder, who can understand?" So Job now is speaking about God's power. There's some interesting tidbits, if you will, in here. Number one, the departed spirits are made to tremble under the waters in their inhabitants. That's something that's sort of interesting. A lot of commentators have trouble exactly knowing what that means. So do I. Verse 6, "Sheol is naked before him. Abaddon has no covering." In other words, Sheol is exposed to him. So when you think about someone who's naked, they're exposed. Okay? Well, Sheol is naked to God. That means that we don't have any understanding of it. To God, it's naked. It's completely exposed. That's all that means. Okay. Verse 7, "He stretches out the north over empty space, hangs the earth on nothing." So we're not just floating on a big jello bowl or something? No, of course not. Obviously, the earth hangs, right, in the sense. And, I mean, look, this is kind of what it looks like. I mean, I've never been to space, admittedly, but from pictures and from illustrations and from observations, you understand that the earth looks as if it's just hanging. Okay? How did Job know this? Did NASA tell him? Of course not. So how did Job know it? Well, you folks are smart. I know you can get this. Wisdom from who? That's right. Mark said it. Wisdom from God. It's the only way. Just like he knows a lot of other things in this book that he says about the afterlife and about the resurrection. It's wisdom from God. He hangs the earth on nothing. It wasn't up until that long ago in the history of human civilization where we even understood that fact. And here the oldest book in the Bible says it. Okay, if there's nothing else that tells you shouldn't question God, this should be one of the verses. Before you go questioning God, read his word. And his word can inform us. So it's a great example of scientific foreknowledge. And just like in the Old Testament law of Moses, whenever God basically gives the Israelites ingredients for soap and tells them to wash themselves and to do this frequently so they keep diseases out of their camp. Oh, of course, that's just common knowledge. Yeah, to us now, you go back a couple hundred years, and there is a man who's made famous for suggesting to his nurses at the hospital that they should wash their hands with soap before they go from woman to woman and help them give birth. They didn't understand why so many babies and women were dying in childbirth. Oh, here's a bright idea. Wash your hands. To us, it's like, well, of course. That wasn't discovered until a couple hundred years ago. Go back into the Old Testament, you see that God told the Israelites to do that thousands of years ago. These are examples of scientific foreknowledge. Things that people wouldn't know, that humanity, the rest of humanity, didn't catch on to until thousands of years later, but somehow, in some way, they're written in here. It's because this book is founded in wisdom that is beyond this world, beyond human convention. And so this is what we see here. He hangs the earth on nothing. Then he goes on to talk more about the clouds and the rain and how God essentially draws lines for things and creates boundaries. We don't know how God does all of his work with the seasons and all the changes of the earth. We don't know how all those things play out and all that happens. But it's interesting to think about it, and we know that God ultimately does it, and whatever way he does it, of course we are okay with. So he goes on to continue to speak about some of these things, mentioning God's power, and then he's going to go back more toward really what the trajectory of the book, and talk about his life and his righteousness and his innocence and things of that nature. But before we move on to chapter 27, any thoughts on 24, 25, or 26? Yep. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Um, yeah, that's definitely a big benefit, and I actually tell people who are newer Christians to stay away from the Old Testament for a while. Some people probably disagree with that, but I try to keep them away from books like Leviticus because they go in there and they start reading that. It's so confusing that they just stop reading. Yeah, you're right, Mark. Job is a wonderful book, but it's a very unique book. And it's not just a book that probably Christians who are just starting out should just crack open and study, because there's a lot of themes in here that are going to be more difficult to understand. If they have some other knowledge as a base before they go in here, it would help. But of course, ultimately, it helps a lot to be able to be together and study these things out together. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. So, chapter 27. Job again took up his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty, who has embittered my soul, for as long as life is in me, and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips certainly will not speak unjustly, nor will my tongue mutter deceit. Far be it from me that I should declare you right. Until I die, I will not give up my integrity." This is a pretty strong statement, because his wife told him, "How do you still hold on to your integrity? Curse God and die." And now Job is saying, "I'm not going to give up my integrity till I die. I will never say that you are right." Pretty strong statement from a man who lost everything and is now sitting in basically a garbage heap with his skin wasting away. You know, what else does Job have to lose? Oftentimes when people are brought into a circumstance or scenario of extreme despair, they'll say almost anything. They'll say almost anything in order to get out of it. And you might think that Job would be the same, but Job says, no. I don't care if what you do say, friends, are right, and you say, if you just repent, then God's going to restore you and everything. I don't even care if you're right. I will never, ever go back on what I've said. Not even if if God would grant you everything, yet not even then. Job right now is willing to die with his integrity and his understanding that I didn't do anything wrong. I really want to emphasize right now for a moment how this is a very grand and bold proclamation, and it's very courageous. Often when humans are put in a corner, they start questioning their own beliefs and they waffle about and they end up changing. We understand this because of things like the mob. How many people have you seen today who go out publicly and say something, and then the mob sort of attacks them and cancels them, and then the next day or in a couple days you see an apology statement by the people and they're retracting everything that they said. This is really how human beings act. This is how many times we would act. This is how the disciples acted in the garden. Remember Peter the day before was all big, bad, and tough and said, "No, Lord, I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I'll die with you." And then Jesus in the garden is being betrayed into the hands of sinners, and where's Peter? Well, you say, well, Peter tried to defend Jesus. He cut off Malchus' ear. Yes, we have to give him that, right? But then where did he go? He didn't cut off Malchus' ear and then say, all right, put me in chains too. I told Jesus I'd die with him, so let's get this going. He didn't do that, did he? He ran. Where did the other disciples go? They left. Why? They were scared. They wanted to live, just like all of us. You know, what they said was how they felt, but when push come to shove, they were willing to change that in their heart if it meant they could continue to live. I'm not rebuking the disciples. I think all of us would be in the same boat. I'm simply pointing out that observation. Job is not going to do that. Job says, no, I'm going to keep my integrity, and I don't care if it would mean that God would grant me more life. I'm not going to repent because I haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to keep holding on to this integrity. Okay. Verse 6. I have kept hold of my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not rebuke any of my days. He believes that he's righteous, and his own conscience does not rebuke what he's done in his days. Certainly he's not saying that he is perfect. However, he cannot recall being an unrighteous sinner in that sense. So verse 7, may my enemy be as the wicked and my opponent as the criminal. For what is the hope of the godless when he makes an end of life? When God requires his life, will God hear his cry when the distress comes upon him? Or will he take pleasure in the Almighty? Will he call on God at all times? I will instruct you in the power of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Behold, all of you have seen it. Why then do you talk of nothing? This is the portion of a wicked person from God, and the inheritance which tyrants receive from the Almighty. Though his sons are many, they are destined for the sword, and his descendants will not be satisfied with bread, and survivors will be buried because of the plague, and their widows will not be able to weep. Now, again, Job here is describing a wicked person's life and how the wicked person dies and is punished. And much of what he says here is comparable to his own life in his own time of suffering. So what is Job saying? Job is saying that I am suffering like the wicked person suffers, but I'm not wicked. That's the difference. Now his friends don't believe that. Certainly he knows that. So verse 13, this is the portion of a wicked person from God. And I just read that actually. Where did we leave off? Verse 16? Yes, we did. Verse 16. Though he piles up silver like dust and prepares garments as plentiful as the clay, he may prepare it, but the righteous will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He has built his house like the spider's web, or a hut which the watchman has made. He lies down rich, but never again. He opens his eyes, and it no longer exists. Terrors overtake him like a flood. The storm steals him away in the night. The east wind carries him away, and he is gone. Some of these euphemisms are interesting. Some of this imagery is almost shockingly funny. That an east wind carries him away, and he's gone. Imagine a wind blowing a person. The person's blowing in the wind miles and miles away. It's almost comical, but this is how Job is describing it. So, an east wind blows, carries him away, and he is gone. For it sweeps him away from his place. For it will hurl at him without mercy. He will certainly try to flee from its power. People will clap their hands at him and will whistle at him from their palaces or from their places. So basically, he's just, in this chapter, describing the life and the circumstance and the outcome of someone who's wicked. Again, I thank Tom and Kurt for teaching. It's not easy to teach Job. So much of this is repeated. You know, I could teach chapter 27 as well as I could probably teach chapter 15. It'd be near the same thing. Job is saying this. If you haven't got it, now get it. Wicked people die, they're punished, and their house, their lives, their families, everything they know comes to ruin. That's what he's saying. That's what he agrees with. To a point, but he also understands that wicked people are also, in a sense, not punished. And he understands that he's being punished even though he's not being wicked. And so these are things that Job is, at this moment, battling with. Okay, what does this last verse mean? People will clap their hands at him and will whistle at him from their places. I want us to turn real quick to the book of Nahum. Nahum. I know, it's like, why in the world are we going to Nahum? Nobody ever goes to Nahum. But there's an interesting thing in the book of Nahum, I think, that actually lines up well with what we just read there, and by way of explaining it. And yes, I still have to in my head go Jonah, Micah, Nahum, especially the minor prophets, because we don't go here very often. So go to Nahum and go to chapter 3 and the end of chapter 3. Start with verse 18. So I'll try to inform you very briefly. Nahum is about the city of Nineveh. Remember, little pop quiz, does anybody remember where Nahum was mentioned, or Nineveh was mentioned before Nahum? Remember, who went to Nineveh? Jonah, right? And was Nineveh spared or destroyed? That's right, Sarah. It was spared, okay? However, in Nahum, a couple generations pass, and destruction's coming because they went right back to their old ways. So that's a good lesson for us. Verse 18. Your shepherds are sleeping, O king of Assyria. Your officers are lying down. Your people are scattered on the mountains. There is no one to gather them. There is no relief for your collapse. Your wound is incurable. All who hear about you will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has your evil not come continually? So that's how Nahum ends. Nahum ends with God basically saying, you have nothing, you have no king, you have no people, and when people hear about your destruction, they're going to shout and clap for joy. Okay, so why did I read that? Well, you go back to Job, and what do we see? How does verse 27 of chapter 27 end? People will clap their hands at him and will whistle at him from their places. That he's describing in this passage a wicked tyrant, and that when he finally gets his just desserts, people are going to be clapping and waving and shouting and whistling because they're going to be happy. In other words, when somebody bad is being punished, people are happy. When someone good is being punished, people are angry. Okay? You take the electric chair. Right? Somebody like, I don't know, Okay, Charles Manson. Someone like Charles Manson, did he get the electric chair? Okay, let me just say this. Somebody like Charles Manson gets the electric chair. Everybody goes, woo, yes, finally we got him. That's right. Justice, right? Okay. Someone who was wrongfully accused and who's innocent gets the electric chair, and everybody goes, no, that's not what we want. So you have the electric chair. In one instance, people are like, yeah, this is good. And in the other instance, people are like, no, this is bad. I used to live in Moundsville. I lived there for 2 years while I was going to school over there. And over in Moundsville is West Virginia State Penitentiary. It's interesting somebody brought up Charles Manson because he actually issued a letter. He wanted to go over to the state penitentiary in Moundsville. And the warden said, no, it's not going to happen. So what's interesting that they used to do over there, and this is far before my time, they used to publicly hang people at the prison that were on death row. And the amount of crowds that would gather to watch a criminal be executed was crazy. So many people from the community would just flood inside the prison to watch somebody get hanged. What does that tell you, people? It might tell you a lot of different things, but here's one thing it tells me. When evil people receive justice for their evil, there's inherently within it something that's celebrated. And this is what Job is saying. When a tyrant or when an evil king, an evil person gets punished, people clap, people shout, people whistle, let's go. Nobody's doing that with Job. Nobody. Nobody's saying, ha, Job's getting his just desserts. Nobody's doing that. Why do you think? Because Job is innocent. And that's really the big argument he's making here. I'm innocent. If I wasn't innocent, there's no way you folks would be here. Because you'd be cheering on my suffering, not trying to console me. And so really, Job hit him with a checkmate. What else are they going to say to that? He now is appealing to their own reasons for coming over. And certainly it wasn't to tell them that he was unrighteous and therefore he should accept it and they should be happy, but to try to help him. And it shows us that the whole time that they're speaking to him, they're just talking out of their heads. They don't really have the understanding that they should. They're just trying to figure out what in the world's going on. And condemning Job in the process. So I think that's time. And, well, we got a couple minutes. Any thoughts or comments or questions about the class or anything? Go ahead, man.
Does he not start out in the first verse saying, well, I'd like it if my enemy was considered wicked and my opponent unjust. I would like it. That would be nice. We can all understand that. Mm-hmm. But then he goes on to say, but it's not so, right? Is that what he's doing here in that first verse?
Yeah.
Saying, well, I wish it were this way.
Yeah. Basically, he's also confused as well as everybody else, but he's saying this is the understanding. In other words, if it made sense, it would be easier. But this is the reality of it. Yeah, you're right, Mark. Yeah. Any other thoughts? All right, thank you all for your time and attention. And once again, I don't see them right now, but thank Tom and Kurt for teaching for me in my absence. And anyone who would do that, really appreciate it, and especially a hard book like Job. So I will now dismiss everybody to have fellowship, and thank you for your time and attention.